He dabbled in the modernist realms of Cubism and Dada, but Marcel Duchamp was really in a league of his own. His radical creations are both humorous and cerebral, designed to prompt that crucial question: is it art? This is Several Circles. In the final throes of 2019, our news feeds went bananas over this: Comedian by the Italian artist Maurizio Cattelan. It debuted at the annual Art Basel Fair in Miami Beach, rotting in real time and perplexing passers-by, especially when it sold in multiple editions for 6 figures each. Of course, bananas have comedic and phallic associations, but Comedian's ultimate punchline is the art market itself.
Bullshit. Bullshit. Derivative.
Comedian is a classic example of conceptual art, by which an artwork's value lives in the idea over the resulting object.
I absolutely love.
That's just the air conditioner.
But Cattelan's exploit, while impressively disruptive, was nothing distinctly new. It winked at the age-old antics of the top banana himself, Marcel Duchamp. This is the infamous fountain, and its enduring impact is pretty spectacular. The story goes that Duchamp and friends purchased a urinal from a local showroom, tipped it back, and slapped a fake attribution on it to conceal its true mastermind. The pseudonym R. Mutt is a real conceptual composite, a partial ode to the urinal's manufacturer, J.L. Mott Iron Works, and a nod to Mutt and Jeff, the dynamic duo who popularized an eponymous cartoon strip in Duchamp's day. Duchamp was particularly wild about wordplay. The R, which stands for Richard, refers to the French slang for a wealthy person, while R. Mutt audibly mimics the word Armut, which is German for poverty. All of these factors, and maybe more, were reverse-engineered to yield an unassuming alias that protected Duchamp's identity when the urinal was submitted to the Society of Independent Artists in New York. Duchamp, who had moved to New York in 1915, was instrumental in establishing the Society of Independent Artists, an organization founded to showcase the latest in contemporary art. For years, the avant-garde's best and brightest inhabited European cities. It was time to position New York as a rivaling stateside art capital. The society was proudly progressive from its inception. Its exhibitions were to be unjuried, which meant that all members' submissions would be accepted in a move to democratize the future of art. So Duchamp was pissed when the board voted to defy their own bylaw and omit Fountain from their upcoming program in the spring of 1917. They did so on the basis that a urinal can't be art, nor was it appropriate to showcase it as such. A simple test of the society's core values, and it buckled under the weight of tradition and formality. It wasn't the first time Duchamp would suffer for his ingenuity. Duchamp was a natural maverick, born in 1887 to a large, well-to-do, and artistically inclined family in the Normandy region of France. In 1904, he joined his older brothers, painter Jacques Villon and sculptor Raymond Duchamp Villon, in Paris, where he briefly attended the esteemed Académie Julian. Duchamp studied Paul Cézanne and post-impressionism, symbolism, namely the work of French visionary Odilon Redon, and vivid, expressionistic fauvism. Duchamp was freely experimental with it all. The chess game, for example, takes stylistic cues from Matisse and Cézanne, with that enveloping green and the reductive geometry of his sitters, but there's a subtle Duchampian strangeness to this otherwise leisurely image of his brothers and their wives, a psychological disquiet. Around 1911, Duchamp found a temporary foothold in Cubism. He grazed the style cultivated by Pablo Picasso and George Braque, but refused that impetus to create according to a unified set of principles. It was in this visceral distaste for conformity that Duchamp found a friend in the writer and poet Guillaume Apollinaire, and Francis Picabia, who likewise became one of the 20th century's most undefinable iconoclasts. Together, the artists borrowed from and simultaneously rejected Cubism and Futurism in the shared pursuit of a completely unfettered approach to creativity. In 1912, Duchamp submitted his nude descending staircase No. 2 to the Salon des Indépendants, the Parisian progenitor of the Society of Independent Artists. It's a revelatory composition that demands more of the viewer, to strain and stretch the limits of our figure-oriented brains to detect a cinematic body composed of shapes and shards. It was clearly made with reference to Cubism and Futurism, but Duchamp considered the time-lapse, pioneered by the English photographer Edward Muybridge. What a radical depiction of the human form in motion, almost indiscernible if not for the title. But it was the title, and consequently the topic, that the Salon couldn't reconcile with. They took issue with the idea of a nude on the go. The nude is an institution in the history of art, a sacred conveyance of beauty and power. Nudes were supposed to recline and entice, not shuffle down a flight of stairs in a cacophony of sinews. The committee decided not to exhibit the painting, and worse, they sent Duchamp's brothers to ask him to withdraw it. He begrudgingly complied, and it was alternatively exhibited at the Salon de la Section d'Or that same year. But the ordeal soured Duchamp's relationship with his brothers, as well as his relationship with painting. It was the same puzzling show of intolerance towards modernists by modernists that Duchamp would experience in New York. Duchamp sent his nude overseas in 1913, where it was included in the inaugural International Exhibition of Modern Art at the 69th Regiment Armory in Manhattan. The Armory Show, as it would become known, was a jolting window into the psyche of the modern artist. The European contributions were especially shocking to Americans, whose contemporary art was comparatively tame, so nude descending a staircase caused a big commotion. Former President Theodore Roosevelt denounced it as part of the quote-unquote lunatic fringe. The New York Times likened it to an explosion in a shingle factory, and the Evening Sun published a cartoon parody entitled The Rude Descending a Staircase, Rush Hour at the Subway. Duchamp was a clever cartoonist himself, so even the critics were speaking his language. But he also gained staunch supporters, the American poet and critic Walter Arensberg, for one, who recognized Duchamp's unorthodox genius. Duchamp reveled in the spirit of the debate over his work. So fast forward to 1917, when this kind of discourse was intercepted by the censorship of Fountain. Duchamp resigned from his post at the Society of Independent Artists in protest, but he did so without revealing that he had anything to do with the submission. He absconded unseen with Fountain, which was subsequently immortalized by the legendary photographer and gallerist Alfred Stieglitz. A headshot, if you will, by which Fountain gushed into the public arena anyway, accompanied by an op-ed written in its defense. Fountain was scandalous, even as a photograph. Fountain asserted that art doesn't have to be beautiful, nor its message self-evident, that a concept can be art, as can an ordinary item that the artist didn't personally craft, but rather chose to reinterpret. It requests that we revise our limited definition of art, and, perhaps more urgently, our limited definition of the artist. Fountain became the most ubiquitous example of a ready-made, a Duchampian term for an object divorced from its utilitarian purpose and represented as a work of art. Duchamp began experimenting with ready-mades circa 1913, a bicycle wheel fastened to a wooden stool, a snow shovel, a bottle rack. It was a reaction to his boredom with painting, which he felt belonged to a tired class of what he called retinal art, art that appeals to the eye but does little to engage the mind. It was the mind that became Duchamp's most fulfilling canvas. He was an avid chess player all his life, and he thought like one, always strategizing and preempting his opponent's next move. His most formidable opponent was the mainstream, and while he had been something of a lone player against the forces of convention, he found lasting camaraderie in a cultural revolution known as Dada. The beginnings of Dada were not the beginnings of art, but of disgust, declared the poet Tristan Tzara. Between 1914 and 1918, World War I wreaked havoc of inconceivable proportions. Duchamp's brother Raymond and his friend Apollinaire were amongst the Great War's estimated 40 million casualties, a mortifying statistic facilitated by vanguard technologies that were supposed to improve society, not obliterate it. So a group of like like-minded intellectuals declared their own war on modernity. It was amid the chaos in 1916 that the German poet Hugo Ball founded Cabaret Voltaire, a Zurich-based space for radical thinkers, named after the famed French Enlightenment writer and philosopher who preached freedom of thought and speech. Droves of anti-war artists and scholars fled to Switzerland for its neutrality, so it was the ideal epicenter from which to spread creative anarchy. The dissenters of Dada went rogue on the establishment by way of so-called anti-art that inverted logic and defied reason. An otherwise nonsensical term, Dada translates to random words across languages, from cube in some Italian dialects to hobby horse in French. So Dada was everything and it was nothing, and it was this precise inscrutability that empowered its practitioners. Max Ernst, Raoul Haussmann, Hannah Hoch, and Jean Arp in Europe, and in New York, Man Ray, Francis Picabia, and Duchamp, amongst others. After all, mockery was the spice of Duchamp's vernacular, and nothing was impervious to his unique charms, not even the Mona Lisa. In 1919, while the masses worshipped her arresting magnetism on the 400th anniversary of Leonardo da Vinci's death, Duchamp spotted a prime opportunity for mischief. His mustachioed Madame appears to be little more than a sophomoric doodle on a postcard, but the simplicity of his gesture belies more impish complexity. There are a few French translations of the letter sequence LHOOQ, the most prominent being, "She has a hot ass," and "There is fire down below." So in a show of irreverence a la Dada, Duchamp was defacing art history and objectifying its most beloved icon in the process. But he approached his takedown with a playful openness, poking fun at the frailty of gender roles. It is interesting that Duchamp chose a goatee to denote masculinity, because he apparently had a chilling phobia of hair. But the concept was well aligned with Duchamp's all-out rejection of the customary. It wasn't long after he made this that he manifested an alter ego, pronounced Eros c'est la vie, which means Eros is life, Eros being the Greek god of sex. Duchamp was fascinated by sex and all the fluids and body parts associated with the deed. It was a preoccupation that he shared with the surrealists, who likewise illustrated their most primal visions and urges haunting the landscapes of their subconscious minds. They were a new group formed in Paris from the embers of Dada in 1924. Duchamp had returned to Paris in 1923, and while his art practice waned in favor of chess, he became a figure of great importance to surrealism founder, André Breton, and he participated in their exhibitions. Duchamp escaped back to New York in 1942, narrowly slipping past Nazi checkpoints by posing as a cheese merchant. The 1940s New York art scene belonged to the burgeoning abstract expressionists, so the hype around Duchamp had cooled, but that changed in the 50s. In 1950, Walter Arensberg and his wife Louise bequeathed their considerable art collection, containing a number of works by Duchamp, to the Philadelphia Museum of Art. The museum unveiled its new acquisitions in 1954, when artists like Robert Rauschenberg and Richard Hamilton were finding new ways of transforming weird and banal things into art. They were laying the groundwork for the pop art movement, which, helmed by Andy Warhol, breathed new life into the ready-made, expressly relevant to the next generation of artists working not only in the arena of pop art, but also minimalism and conceptualism. Duchamp started giving rare interviews that offered precious insight into his opaque creative process. While this feels like the antithesis of a Duchampian move, he was largely retired from art making by this point, content to enjoy his mythic status and play chess day in and day out. He married his second wife, nicknamed Teeny Sattler, in 1954. He was briefly wedded to Lydie Fisher Sarrazin Levasseur in the late 1920s, but the knot untied after less than a year. His devotion to chess seemingly outweighed his devotion to her, and she allegedly wound up furiously gluing his chess pieces to the board. Later in life, Duchamp could more peacefully indulge his love of the game, while he toiled in secret for more than 20 years on his final work of art, a diorama of a woman lying spread eagle in a forest. It's a strange, symbolic, and surreal image, perhaps an extension of his earlier work, The Bride Stripped Bare by Her Bachelors even, also referred to as The Large Glass. For years, Duchamp labored over this curious installation until he declared it definitively unfinished in 1923. It was accidentally damaged in transit a few years later, a detail that Duchamp felt brought it closer to completion.
They put the two paints on top of one another on a truck, flat, not knowing what they were carrying, and bouncing for 60 miles in Connecticut. So that's what happened. But the more I look at it, the more I like the cracks because they're not like shattered glass. They have a shape. There's a symmetry in the cracking. The two crackings are symmetrically disposed, and there's more, almost an intention there. An extra curious intention that I'm not responsible for. Ready-made intention, in other words.
It's a thoroughly bizarre assemblage, thought to be an entanglement of musings on desire and chemistry. Duchamp's, or rather Eros c'est la vie's, so-called green box of accompanying notes and sketches for this piece both illuminates and mystifies its meaning. The bride, fixed in the upper panel, is physically and metaphysically separated from the bachelors below, who eternally endeavor to win her affections. The diorama poses an equally frustrating impossibility. We can see the subject through two peepholes and a wooden door, but we will never obtain her. It was only after Duchamp died in 1968 that the diorama was discovered. Today, it's housed at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, alongside the large glass and fountain, though the original urinal was lost sometime after it was photographed. Duchamp's peers had long suspected that fountain was one of his ready-mades, a cliffhanger that Duchamp left unaddressed for decades. He eventually took credit for the stunt and authorized the production of replicas, which are now in the collections of museums around the world. The hitch is that Duchamp's role in the whole Fountain saga has since been called into question, for the argument that Fountain was more likely the brainchild of Dada poet and artist Baroness Elsa von Freytag-Loringhoven. It's a contentious idea that this thing of such immense importance to modern art isn't what we thought it was, and we're not here to editorialize either way. But Fountain's dubious authorship is a fitting epilogue to Duchamp's narrative. He was, after all, an absurdist and a provocateur. The debate rages on, and we can only imagine that somewhere out there, Duchamp is positively flushed. Thanks for watching Several Circles. Don't forget to subscribe for more videos about the lives and work of extraordinary artists, and let us know in the comments if there's an artist you'd like to know more about.